The year is 1945, and the war in Europe is drawing to its catastrophic close. The Allied forces, relentless in their push eastward, are seizing territory from the collapsing Third Reich. The sounds of war, bombs, gunfire, the roar of tanks are beginning to fade. But for many, the consequences of the conflict are far from over. For some, the end of the war brings a new, unexpected struggle. Among these are the women of the German army, many of whom now find themselves imprisoned far from their homeland, caught in the sprawling camps of the American South. One of the largest of these camps is located in Texas, where thousands of German women, captured during the final days of the war, are held under American supervision. These women, who once stood behind the front lines of war, are now prisoners of a new kind. Those who had been enemies just days before, now subject to the laws and mercy of the United States. The land, vast and unfamiliar, stretches for miles in every direction. The dry, oppressive heat a stark contrast to the war-torn cities and towns they once knew. The transition for these women is jarring. Just a few weeks ago, they had been part of a war machine that had dominated much of Europe. Their training as medical officers, support staff, and in some cases military personnel, had prepared them for a brutal, uncompromising world. Now here in Texas, they find themselves displaced, uncertain, and at the mercy of their captors. The American soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, and speaking a language they barely understood, had once been the enemy. Now they were the ones who would decide their fate. For the first time in their lives, these German women found themselves stripped of the power and authority that had been the hallmark of their roles in the Nazi regime. The change was more than just a shift in physical surroundings. It was an identity crisis. How could they reconcile their identity as members of a military force that had sought to conquer and control with the humiliating reality of being detained in a foreign land? These women, many of whom had lost their families, homes and futures, now faced a different kind of internal battle, one that required them to accept their new reality and come to terms with the humanity of their captors. And it is here, in the heart of Texas, that something unexpected begins to happen. Over the course of the year that follows their capture, many of these women begin to see their American captors not as the monstrous enemy they had been conditioned to hate, but as individuals capable of kindness, respect, and even admiration. In the confines of the Texas camps, where the women are forced to interact with their captors on a daily basis, a strange, subtle transformation occurs. The harshness of war recedes, replaced by a recognition of shared humanity. The prisoners are no longer the faceless enemies they had been taught to despise. They become people in their own right, individuals who have experienced loss, fear, and trauma in ways that are strikingly similar to their own. For many of the German women, the turning point comes when they are exposed to the daily routines of life in the camp. The American soldiers, unlike the brutal officers of the German military, treat them with an unexpected level of humanity. They are provided with food, shelter, and medical care, basics that were increasingly scarce in Germany during the final months of the war. In stark contrast to their previous experiences, the American soldiers go out of their way to ensure the women's basic needs are met, offering them the kindness and empathy that had been lacking in their own military upbringing. One of the most striking differences is the treatment of the women by the American nurses who staff the camps. These women, many of whom had served in the U.S. Army Nursing Corps, were well versed in the demands of their work, but they also carried an inherent belief in the value of every human life, regardless of nationality. They didn't see the German women as enemies, but as individuals who had suffered under the same global conflict. For the German women, this treatment was a revelation. In the sterile white tents of the camp infirmary, they are treated not as prisoners of war, but as human beings in need of care and compassion. Sarah, an American nurse, recalls her first interactions with a group of German POWs. "It was hard at first to not see them as just the enemy," she said years after the war. "But then, after a few weeks, I started to realize they were just women who had lived through hell just like we had. And when you start seeing them that way, the lines between enemy and friend start to, blur." This shift in perspective was not unique to Sarah. It was a sentiment shared by many of the American soldiers and medical staff who worked with the German prisoners. As time went on, some of the German women began to forge unlikely bonds with their American captors. Conversations, once strained by language barriers, began to flow more easily. The guards, once imposing figures, were now seen as individuals with names and stories. For the first time in the camps, these German women began to experience the strange warmth of human connection in a place that was initially nothing but alien and hostile. They began to see the complexity of their captors, soldiers who, though charged with the task of keeping them detained, were not immune to the same fears, doubts, and personal struggles that had plagued the German forces. One such relationship was between Maria, a former nurse in the German military, and Lieutenant James, a young American officer in charge of the camp. Maria had been captured during a skirmish in the final days of the war and was brought to the camp in Texas for treatment. Initially, Maria saw James as just another soldier, one who would stand watch over her and her fellow prisoners. But as the days passed, she began to notice the small acts of kindness he extended to the prisoners. He would ask how they were feeling, bring them extra food when possible, and even find time to speak with them in broken German and English. His genuine concern for their well-being, despite the war between their nations, slowly began to chip away at Maria's hardened exterior. She started to see James as more than just a symbol of the enemy. He was a human being caught in the same war, facing the same devastation. As Maria spent more time in the camp, her feelings toward the Americans began to shift. She began to understand that the soldiers and officers she had once seen as the enemy were not all that different from herself. They too had families, dreams, and desires. They too had been shaped by the war, and many of them had their own stories of loss and hardship. The humanity of the Americans, displayed in the smallest acts of kindness, left a lasting impression on Maria and many of her fellow prisoners. The year they spent in the Texas camps was transformative for the German women in more ways than one. By the time the war officially ended and they were repatriated to Germany, many of these women found it difficult to return to the lives they had known before the war. The bond they had formed with their American captors, however brief, was something they could never forget. The realization that their captors, despite being on the other side of the war, had treated them with dignity and respect, left them with a profound sense of shame and guilt over the atrocities committed by their own side. As these women returned to a devastated Germany, the memories of their time in the Texas camps became an anchor for many. They had experienced the kindness and humanity of their captors, and it was a lesson they carried with them for the rest of their lives. For some, it was a moment of personal reckoning, a realization that the war had not only destroyed their country, but had forced them to confront their own biases and misconceptions. They had come face to face with the truth that, in the midst of a brutal conflict, it was possible for even the greatest of enemies to show compassion and mercy. For the American soldiers and medical staff who had worked with the German women, the experience was equally profound. Many of them too left the camps with a deeper understanding of the true nature of war. It was not simply a battle between nations, it was a battle of human hearts, and in the most unlikely places, compassion could still find its way through the darkness. As the war ended and the world began to rebuild, the relationships forged in the Texas camps would remain a quiet, unspoken testament to the possibility of peace and understanding, even in the aftermath of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. These women, once enemies, had come to understand that despite the war, they shared a common humanity with their captors, and that was something that could never be taken away. The year spent in the Texas camps would forever leave an indelible mark on the German women who had been prisoners of war, shaping not only their perceptions of the war, but also their views of the world that followed. As the years passed and Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes of defeat, the memories of their time in captivity would linger, never quite fading. What began as a period of deep humiliation and fear for many of them would transform into a complex experience, one that blurred the lines between enemy and ally, compassion and animosity. The story of these German women and their relationship with their American captors would become an emotional reflection of the humanity that could emerge even in the darkest hours of history. After their release, many of the women returned to Germany, a country that was in the midst of picking up the pieces of its broken past. The physical devastation was visible. The cities in ruins, families torn apart, and an entire generation of soldiers and civilians left to grapple with the war's aftermath. Yet the psychological and emotional scars were perhaps even deeper. For those who had fought for the Nazi regime, the return to a country in defeat was not just about rebuilding. It was about reconciling with their own involvement in the war and understanding their role in a system that had caused so much destruction. Maria, one of the German nurses who had spent a year in the Texas camps, returned to a Germany that was at once both familiar and alien to her. Though the camps had offered her a unique perspective on the war, one that exposed her to the humanity of the enemy, the country she returned to had not changed in the way she had hoped. The sense of guilt she carried with her was immense. She had been part of a military that had committed atrocities across Europe, and now, in the aftermath of that war, she was forced to reckon with the repercussions of her actions. Her experience in Texas, where she had been treated with respect and care, contrasted starkly with the environment in Germany, where the past was still largely unspoken, a heavy silence hanging over those who had served the Nazi cause. Maria's encounter with her fellow Germans, many of whom had suffered in similar ways, was often strained. There was no easy way to explain the transformation she had undergone in the American camps. How could she explain to her fellow countrymen that the enemy she had been trained to fear had shown her kindness, had offered her a second chance, while her own people had inflicted suffering and destruction? This dissonance left Maria feeling like a stranger in her own land. She couldn't forget the faces of the American soldiers who had treated her with dignity, who had listened to her when she spoke, and who had cared for her in the way she had never been cared for in the war-torn hospitals of Germany. But Maria was not alone. Many of the women who had been prisoners in Texas faced similar challenges upon their return. The war had broken them in ways they could not have imagined, and their experiences in captivity forced them to confront not only the destruction of their nation, but also their complicity in the violence. They had been part of a system that had waged war on a global scale, and now in the rubble of that system, they were forced to rebuild their own identities. In a way, the year spent in Texas became a lens through which these women could view the world after the war. It was not just the physical care they had received in the camps, it was the emotional care, the moments of humanity and understanding that had shown them the possibility of a world where enemies could coexist. They had experienced firsthand the kindness of strangers, and that kindness was something that would resonate with them for the rest of their lives. For the American soldiers and nurses, the experience of caring for German prisoners of war had also left a profound impact. Many of them, particularly those who had witnessed the brutalities of the war firsthand, had initially viewed the German prisoners with disdain, seeing them as symbols of an evil regime that had caused untold suffering. But over the course of the year, as they interacted with the German women, many began to see them as people, individuals who had been swept up in the machinery of war, just as they had been. The nurses, especially, who had once been accustomed to seeing the enemy as faceless figures in a distant conflict, came to recognize that the prisoners were more than just their uniforms. They were women with families, with hopes, with fears, and most importantly, with the same needs for compassion and care that any other human being required. Sarah, the nurse who had taken care of Maria, recalled the moments when she began to truly see the German prisoners as individuals. It wasn't easy at first, she admitted years later. We were told to take care of them, but there was always this feeling that they were the enemy. But over time I realized something. They were just like us. They had been part of a system, just like we had been part of our own. And when you start seeing them as people, everything changes. The emotional and moral reckoning that both the German women and the American soldiers experienced in those Texas camps would become a defining aspect of their post-war lives. For the German women, it was a lesson in humility, a recognition of their own humanity, and a painful awakening to the truth of their role in the war. For the American soldiers, it was a moment of growth, an understanding that the enemy was not always what they had been taught to believe. As the years passed, the stories of these women would be shared in whispers, but they were stories of hope. Hope that even in the darkest moments of history, compassion and understanding could still be found. The legacy of those Texas camps would live on in the lives of the women who had been held there. in the memories of the American soldiers who had cared for them, and in the broader story of how, even in the aftermath of the greatest conflict the world had ever known, the human spirit could still rise above hatred and violence. The question that lingered after the war: how could these women, once enemies, find peace with their past? Would never have a simple answer. For some, the experience of the Texas camps would remain a complex, haunting chapter of their lives. For others, it would be a reminder that even in the most broken moments of history, there was the possibility of change, of growth, and of a future built on shared humanity. It was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, one that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to be human, that in the end, it was not the uniform you wore, the side you fought for, or the flag you saluted. It was the kindness you showed to others that defined your legacy. And so, for those German women who spent a year in Texas, the experience became more than just a chapter in their lives. It was a turning point, a place where they began to see the possibility for reconciliation, for healing, and for a world beyond the war, one that, despite its scars, was still capable of compassion and understanding. But the journey of the German women who had been held in the American POW camps in Texas during and after World War II reflects more than just the immediate effects of their captivity. It reveals a profound transformation in their relationship with not only their captors, but also their own post-war identities and understanding of the world around them. As the years passed and these women returned to a post-war Germany that was slowly rebuilding itself, many of them found that the emotional and psychological scars of their time in captivity ran deep. Returning to a defeated nation meant confronting not just the physical ruins of their homeland, but also the collapse of their own beliefs and national pride. For some, the trauma they had experienced during the war, coupled with the unexpected kindness they received from American soldiers, would be a paradox that would shape the rest of their lives. The year they spent in Texas, while difficult and complicated, had given them a unique insight into the possibility of reconciliation and healing in a world that had been torn apart by hatred. The women found themselves not just caught between two countries, but between two worlds, one in which they had been raised to see the enemy as less than human, and another in which they had experienced firsthand the compassion of those very same enemies. This paradox left many struggling to reconcile the two worlds they inhabited. On one hand, they had been part of a military force that had inflicted suffering on others, and on the other, they had been treated with dignity and care by those who had been their adversaries. This duality was something they would never be able to fully escape. For some of the women, the kindness they had experienced in the Texas camps would become a quiet burden they carried throughout their lives. Maria, for example, returned to her home in southern Germany, where she was hailed by some as a hero for her service during the war. However, she struggled with a deep sense of guilt, unable to shake the memory of the American nurses who had cared for her. How could she reconcile her past with the kindness she had received? Could she return to the life she had known, given the things she had witnessed and the lessons she had learned in captivity? These questions haunted her, and over time they shaped her relationship with her country and her family. Maria's story was not unique. Many of the German women who had been POWs in Texas found themselves grappling with the psychological aftermath of their experiences. They could not simply return to the world they had known before the war. They had been irrevocably changed by their time in the camps. The compassion they had experienced from their American captors forced them to question everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. The walls of hatred and propaganda that had once separated them from their enemies had crumbled in the face of human kindness, leaving them to wonder what the true cost of their participation in the war had been. But for some, the experiences in Texas also served as a profound moment of personal growth. The year spent in captivity, though traumatic, had allowed them to see the world in a new light. No longer were they bound by the ideologies of their past, and in many ways, they came to understand the war as not simply a conflict between nations, but a tragedy for all involved. The soldiers on both sides had been pawns in a game they had little control over, and the human cost of the war had been far greater than they had ever understood. For the American soldiers and nurses who had cared for the German POWs, the experience also left an indelible mark. They had been trained to see the Germans as the enemy, as the people responsible for the destruction of Europe. But over time, many of these soldiers began to see the women in the camps not as faceless enemies, but as people who had been caught in the same conflict, just as they had. This realization was difficult for some to accept, and for many it led to an internal struggle. How could they reconcile their duty as soldiers with the compassion they felt for their captives? How could they care for these women, who had once been the embodiment of everything they had fought against? Some soldiers, particularly those who had served in combat, found themselves confronting the reality of war in a way they had never anticipated. They had seen the horrors of the battlefield, the destruction wrought by bombs and artillery, and the toll of human suffering. But now, in the calm of the POW camps, they saw the human cost of war in a new way. These were not just soldiers. They were people, women who had loved, who had families, and who had been caught up in a conflict that had torn their world apart. This realization had a profound effect on many of the soldiers, leading them to question the very nature of the war and the ideology that had driven it. In the years that followed, the relationships between former POWs and their American captors evolved in unexpected ways. Some of the German women maintained correspondence with the American soldiers and nurses who had cared for them, even after their repatriation. These letters, though rare, were a testament to the bond that had been formed between captor and captive, a bond that transcended national boundaries and the horrors of war. For many, these letters represented a quiet act of reconciliation, a way of coming to terms with the past and finding a sense of peace in the aftermath of war. The story of the German women who were held in Texas is one of unexpected humanity in the face of war. It is a story of how, in the most unlikely of circumstances, compassion can emerge from even the deepest conflict. The year spent in captivity became a turning point for many of these women, a moment in which they were forced to confront not only the reality of war, but also the humanity of their captors. The kindness they experienced in the POW camps became a symbol of what was possible, even in the darkest days of history, a reminder that, in the end, it is our shared humanity that can bring us together, even after the most devastating of wars. For the German women, the journey they undertook in the American camps was more than just a physical one. It was an emotional journey that forced them to question everything they had known, to confront their own beliefs, and to find new meaning in a world forever changed by war. And for the American soldiers and nurses who cared for them, the experience was a reminder that war is not simply fought on the battlefield. It is fought in the hearts and minds of those who experience its horrors. The relationships forged in the Texas camps were a testament to the possibility of peace, of reconciliation, and of healing, even in the aftermath of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. In the years that followed, these women carried with them the memories of their time in captivity, a time when enemies became allies, when compassion overcame hatred, and when the wounds of war, though deep, could begin to heal. And as they moved forward with their lives, they did so with the knowledge that, despite everything, humanity had found a way to shine through the darkness.